Rain slashed across the Wyoming plains, turning the night into a frenzy of wind and water. Jonah McCrae stood by the fireplace, listening to the storm rattle the windows like a wild animal trying to claw its way in. He preferred nights like this, when the world outside was louder than the noise in his own head. But the knock on the door shattered that fragile calm. 3 quick raps. Urgent. Uneasy. He froze. No one ever came here after dark. Not since his wife died. Not since he made sure of it. The knock came again, sharper this time. He grabbed the lantern, swung the door open. And there she was. A young woman stood on the porch, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, breath hitching in visible clouds. She clutched her coat tightly around her chest as if shielding something inside. Lightning flared behind her, outlining her trembling frame. Her eyes met his, wide and wild. "I took it off, please," she whispered, voice cracking. For a heartbeat, Jonah said nothing. The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of wet earth and danger. She swayed on her feet, exhausted, and he saw past the mud and panic. She was terrified, not of the storm, but of something else entirely. "Get in," he muttered. She stumbled over the threshold, nearly collapsing as the door slammed shut behind her. Water pooled on the floor where she stood shivering, her fingers digging into the coat fabric. Jonah hadn't had a stranger in his home for years. He didn't like it. But something in her eyes, raw, desperate, kept him from sending her back into the night. He fetched a wool blanket from the chair and handed it over. She flinched when his hand came near like a spooked colt. He pulled back slowly, letting her take the blanket herself. She wrapped it around her shoulders, but her eyes kept darting toward the door, as if expecting it to burst open. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she whispered, barely audible over the crackling fire. "All right, Sarah," he said, setting the lantern on the table. "You want to tell me why you're on my porch in the middle of a damn storm?" Her jaw trembled. "They're coming." Jonah narrowed his eyes. "Who?" She hesitated, then slowly opened her coat. Inside was a heavy iron collar, rusted and slick with rain, sitting in her arms like a corpse. The skin around her neck was raw and bruised where the collar had been. "I took it off," she repeated, tears mingling with rainwater. "I ran. But they'll find me. And when they do, they'll kill me. And you too." Jonah stared at the collar, a chill crawling up his spine. He didn't know what kind of trouble this was, but it wasn't small. He poured her a mug of coffee, the only kindness he could think of, and placed it on the table. She stared at it for a long moment before her trembling hands lifted it to her lips. He studied her quietly. She couldn't be more than 19. Dirt streaked her cheeks, her boots were torn, and she carried the brittle wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust anyone. Jonah recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror after the accident. People who'd lost too much too fast wore it like armor. "You picked the wrong ranch," he said flatly. "I don't get involved in folks' messes." She looked up sharply, hurt flashing through the fear. "Then don't. Just don't tell them I was here. Please." Jonah almost agreed. He'd spent years building walls around his life, letting the world pass him by. But something about the way she said, "please," cracked through those defenses. It wasn't begging. It was the sound of someone who'd run out of places to run. He sighed and glanced toward the window. The wind had shifted. Beneath the storm's roar, another sound emerged. Distant hoofbeats. Faint but growing louder. She heard it too. Her cup rattled as she set it down. "No," she whispered. "Not yet. They shouldn't have found me so fast." Jonah's stomach tightened. He crossed to the gun cabinet, pulled out his rifle and checked the chamber. The metal felt cold and familiar in his hands, though he hadn't touched it since the night his wife died. He remembered that night vividly. The blood, the flash of lightning, the silence afterward. He'd sworn never to fire a gun again unless it was to protect himself. Apparently, that moment had arrived. "How many?" he asked. "3, maybe 4, she said shakily. "They always ride together." Through the rain-streaked window, flickers of torchlight appeared at the far edge of the property. Jonah's pulse quickened. Nobody came this far out unless they meant trouble. He moved to the door, lantern extinguished to keep the house dark. The storm made visibility poor, but he could make out shapes, riders slowing their pace, scanning the ranch. Sarah crept to his side, clutching the blanket around her like armor. "If they find me." "They won't," he said more firmly than he felt. "Stay here." "You can't fight them alone," she hissed. "I don't need to fight 'em. Just need to make 'em think they picked the wrong ranch." He stepped onto the porch, the storm lashing against him, rifle steady in his hands. Lightning split the sky, illuminating 3 riders fanning out in front of the house. They weren't townsfolk. Their silhouettes carried the menace of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. The lead rider cupped his hands around his mouth. "Evenin', McCrae. We know she's in there. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you live." Jonah's heart thudded like a hammer. He hadn't heard his name spoken like that, mocking, cold, since his wife's funeral. He tightened his grip on the rifle. "You're trespassing," he called back. "Turn around before I make you regret it." A pause followed, filled with the roar of rain and the uneasy shuffle of horses. Then the leader laughed, low and cruel. "You got guts, old man. Let's see how far they get you." Jonah stepped back toward the doorway, locking eyes with Sarah. She was pale, her breath shallow, but there was something else there too. Hope, fragile and flickering. He didn't know what kind of nightmare she'd escaped, but he did know one thing. He wasn't about to hand her back to it. The riders began to dismount. Jonah raised the rifle. The storm raged. The night held its breath. And for the first time in years, Jonah McCrae felt alive. Rain sheeted down as Jonah steadied his rifle, breath clouding in the cold air. The riders advanced through the mud with slow, deliberate steps, their boots sinking with wet thuds. 3 against 1. He'd faced worse odds before, but not since the night everything went wrong. A flash of lightning carved their faces into sharp relief. Hard men with eyes that glittered like the edges of knives. The leader wore a dark oilskin coat and a sneer that suggested he already believed he'd won. Jonah didn't give them the chance to speak again. He fired a warning shot into the mud at their feet. The rifle cracked like thunder, echoing across the plains. 2 horses reared. 1 man cursed. Jonah's voice cut through the storm. "This is private land. Leave while you can." The leader chuckled. "You ain't protectin' her because you care. You're just too stupid to know who you're dealin' with." "I don't need to know," Jonah replied. "Only need you off my porch." Another rider started circling toward the barn, trying to flank him. Jonah adjusted his aim, cold calculation sliding into place like an old habit he'd tried to bury. His heartbeat slowed, focus narrowing until there was nothing but angles, timing, and the steady pressure of his finger on the trigger. The storm faded to background noise. Behind him, the door creaked. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, still wrapped in the blanket. "Jonah," she whispered. "They'll kill you. They always do." He didn't glance back. "Then they'll have to work for it." One of the riders lunged forward, drawing his revolver. Jonah dropped low, fired, and the man toppled into the mud with a strangled cry. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the rain, bullets punching splinters from the porch railing. Sarah screamed and ducked inside. Jonah rolled behind a support post, reloading by touch, the old motions smooth as muscle memory. They were pressing hard, but their torches betrayed them. He aimed at the flames, snuffing them one by one until darkness swallowed the yard. Now they were blind, stumbling through the storm. Jonah used the cover to move silently along the porch edge, mud soaking his boots. He could hear one of them cursing, another breathing hard nearby. He waited for the lightning flash, then fired again, catching a glimpse of a man falling backward. The leader shouted, furious, "You're making a mistake, McCrae. You think this ends tonight? We'll burn you out." Jonah almost laughed. "That'd save me the trouble of fixin' the roof." A sudden crash inside made him whirl. One of the riders had broken through a side window, boots crunching glass as he stumbled into the parlor. Sarah grabbed the rifle Jonah kept mounted above the mantel, fumbling to aim it. The intruder lunged for her. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the shot went wide, shattering a lamp. He grabbed her by the arm, wrenching the gun away. She bit him hard, and he shoved her toward the wall. Jonah burst through the door, tackling the man before he could strike again. They crashed into the table, sending coffee mugs flying. The rifle skittered across the floor. Jonah drove his elbow into the man's ribs, but the attacker was young and strong, fueled by fury. They grappled on the floor, grunting and slipping in spilled coffee and rainwater. The man's hand found a knife. Jonah twisted, but the blade sliced his shoulder, hot pain searing through fabric and flesh. Sarah snatched the fallen rifle, eyes wide, breath ragged. Jonah saw her hesitate, just for a heartbeat. She'd never done this before. She didn't want to become the kind of person who had. But then she saw the knife raised above Jonah, saw the blood. Her expression hardened. She pulled the trigger. The blast filled the room. The man jerked, then crumpled. The knife clattered to the floor. Silence followed, broken only by the storm hammering the roof. Jonah lay there, chest heaving, staring at the ceiling beams. He hadn't asked for this fight. He'd tried to shut the world out, to keep the pain buried. But here it was again, bleeding into his home like the rain. And he was still standing. Sarah dropped the rifle, hands shaking violently. I didn't mean to. He pushed himself up, gripping his shoulder to stop the bleeding. You did what you had to, he said softly. Ain't no shame in survivin'. The leader's voice bellowed from outside. Enough games. We're settin' fire to the place. Through the window, Jonah saw torchlight flare again. They meant it. If they couldn't have Sarah, they'd destroy everything else. He turned to her, decisive now. We can't stay. Pack what you can carry. We're leaving. Her eyes widened. Where? Anywhere they ain't. While she hurried to grab food and dry clothes, Jonah bandaged his wound and saddled the horses. Each movement was quick, efficient, purposeful. He wasn't the man who'd hidden on this ranch anymore. Something inside him had shifted. Quietly but irreversibly. They met at the back door as smoke began to curl under the eaves. Flames licked the barn's outer wall. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the home she'd barely entered. What about you? This is your life. He looked back at the house. The rain made the fire hiss and spit, but it wouldn't be enough to stop it. The ranch had always been his refuge, but lately it had felt more like a cage. Some things you can rebuild, he said. Some you shouldn't. They mounted up as the first orange glow spread across the roof. Jonah spurred his horse into the dark, Sarah clinging behind him, the storm swallowing them whole. Wind tore at their coats, mud splashed their legs, and the world narrowed to the rhythm of hooves pounding through wet earth. Behind them, the ranch burned brighter, a beacon to anyone watching. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Jonah felt the ache in his shoulder, the weight of the night pressing on him, but also a strange, fierce clarity. He'd made a choice. He wasn't running from the world anymore. He was running toward something, though he didn't yet know what. By dawn, the storm had broken. Mist rose from the drenched fields like breath from sleeping giants. They slowed near a ridge overlooking the plains. The horizon glowed faintly gold, promising a new day. Sarah turned to him, exhausted but alive. What happens now? He stared at the rising sun. He didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in years, that didn't frighten him. We keep riding, he said. We figure it out on the way. She nodded, a small spark of trust flickering in her eyes. For both of them, the road ahead was uncertain, but the past no longer held their reins. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay a future neither could have imagined when the storm began. And for Jonah McCrae, that was enough to keep going.